Hi, everybody. Welcome to Ask an Addiction Specialist. Welcome back. I was gone last week. Really happy to be here this week. I'm Dr. Bob Weathers. Really happy to be with you. We began a series 2 weeks ago, the topic being shame, men, and recovery. And it was then opening into what I hope to be a healing dialogue. And part of the backdrop for this is addressing the many virtues and benefits that have been had in the last 6 months to a year with the Me Too movement, where men have begun to be held accountable for discrimination, harassment, all kinds of other violations of women primarily. And in that context, it brought to mind the work that I've been doing for the last couple of years here locally at Beginnings Treatment Center, working with men. Twice a week I meet with men who are early in recovery, oftentimes from serious addiction to heroin and methamphetamine, for example. And in these groups, I'm working with men to, first of all, help them towards sustained sobriety. But in the process of this, in fact, I'm just coming from a group today, in the process of these conversations with a deep awareness that virtually all of the men in the group, and I'm one of them insofar as I'm in recovery myself, we have all crossed boundaries or violated the relationships that we've been in that have been centermost to us. And so it's very much a common part of our conversations. What can we do to heal what has happened and make sure it doesn't happen again? It's in that spirit that I introduced this first podcast 2 weeks ago on shame, men, and recovery. Today, in essence, is part 2 of that. Same topic, and we're going to take it into a more practical domain. I want to say this right from the beginning, is that we'll be in addressing what we will be addressing today, we'll be answering or responding to a question that was posed by one of our viewers, Angela, who asked during our last meeting, and I just missed the question. She says, how do we build bridges for men to deal with shame? She asked, what do you suggest we do to support each other to unshame? So this is part 1 of my response to your question, Angela. And as you'll see towards the end, I'll be talking about a second part that we'll be getting to next week as well. So let me just say this, is that we'll be looking at today at helping men to make amends in a way that matters. And the men I work with are all in recovery. And so we'll be looking at making amends today, and I'll give you more of a context for that in just a moment. Let me also suggest this, is that I really want to recommend or invite you to submit questions today. I have a lot of people in the audience today, and I really would love to respond to questions as they come up for you. Also, I've been recommended by my 2 co-producers, Austin Armstrong, Franz Salvatierra, to suggest that in the comments section, you're looking at the live video right now. In the comments section, it'd be really interesting if you wouldn't mind logging in just to say where you're from. Be really curious. We have people from all around the country and the world watching us right now. So if you wouldn't mind doing that, that'd be awesome. That's also where you can submit questions, by the way. You're also welcome, and invite you to tag a friend if you have a friend that might be interested in seeing this, or share. There's a button for sharing this. And so Austin and Franz would like to help us get the word out there about this podcast and the content too. So I want you to feel like you can be an active part of that by both sharing with us where you're from, questions that come up, and then also share this with friends. So thank you. I'll be reminding you to submit questions, but you can dive in, and I've given Austin full license to interrupt me at will because I like responding and interacting with you. So okay, so just as a little bit of a backdrop, I introduced this 2 weeks ago. For the past 2 years, I've been working with this weekly group for men. We started off calling it the shame group, but that seemed like a inaccurate or even perhaps demoralizing moniker. And so we've come up with this. We call it the unshaming group. And as I review the work of the last 2 years, and this again addresses Angela's question about what's to be done here, is that there have been a couple of skill sets, a couple of foci that we've taken and repeated them that have really been of service to the men in the group. And certainly whatever I bring to the groups is something that I'm also working on personally. So I want to vouch for these two domains as being really important to me personally as well. The first one is the topic of today. So as we look at unshaming, we're going to be looking at how can we encourage men to learn the skills of making amends that are profound, heartfelt, and effective. And then next week, we'll be looking at a second skill set. These are overlapping for sure, and that is men learning the art, learning the art of self-forgiveness. And it's, if I could create a diagram with a circle going between the two of them, or arrows going from one to the next, I've found in my experience working with the men in our groups is that you have to start somewhere. So we talk about, in fact, today's group addressed learning how to make amends. And we looked at it specifically from the perspective of men in terms of barriers to men being able to say they're sorry. And we'll discuss those today as well here. And that right neck and neck in that whole limitation or hurdle for men in terms of saying they're sorry comes shame. As one individual in the groups today said it, he said, shame is self-hatred. And so unless you address the self-hatred, the self-loathing, the self-judgment, it makes it very hard to extend an olive branch and to say you're sorry. And as I shared later in the group today, it's oftentimes in mending relationships by extending that olive branch that we experience the reduction in our shame. It's that we get a response that actually builds confidence rather than shame. So that's what I mean. I don't know how to separate these two out in real time, other than as we discuss them, we'll discuss them separately, but they inform one another intimately. So then today's topic is making amends deeply and effectively with a focus on men's work. There's a question that's come in. We actually have Tish is watching us from Albuquerque, New Mexico. Thank you for checking in, Tish. Really happy for you to be with us today, and hope all is well in Albuquerque. I was in Louisiana and Texas this last weekend, and I flew over New Mexico on the way back to the LA area over the weekend. So welcome to you. It's great to have you. There's a quote that I shared last week by Dr. Robert Augustus Masters. He's someone that I've gotten to know through another podcast that I'm involved in called the Journey of Integral Recovery podcast. And Robert came on our series and presented to us in another forum, reaching out to individuals seeking recovery from addiction. And Robert had this to say. He says that the most powerful emotional roadblock for men is shame. The most powerful emotional roadblock for men is shame. If I can take Robert's comment and apply it here, the most powerful roadblock to really successfully making amends is shame. And so let's talk about what that looks like for men. Shame in men, as we discussed before, manifests as, it doesn't manifest. Let me pause there. It doesn't manifest. And why does it not show up? There's a deep prohibition for most of us men as we're socialized through childhood into manhood. There's a deep prohibition against vulnerability. In fact, as I was asking the group of men today, we had a good number of men across the age range. One of the new men in the group said that for him to feel shame is to feel weak. And that's really what we're saying. There's the rules of being a man are anti-weakness, whatever weakness is. And so with this prohibition against vulnerability, it leaves men with very few options, and none of them move in the direction of being able to say they're sorry. I posed this to the group today, and the first gentleman that responded talked about how it is that in response to shame, what we do is that we bottle it up. And as we interacted more about this, we men have a tendency of bottling up all emotions, maybe particularly shame, because there is this huge rule against being that vulnerable or being weak. And so we bottle it up, and we distance, in a sense, from ourselves, from our own emotional experience. And hand in hand with that is that we'll distance from others in our lives. So we'll distance from our loved ones. In some ways, the flip side of that, because they're so integrally woven together, is the other alternative for men, other than shame, is aggression. And in fact, as we talked about bottling things up, several of us discussed what it's like to bottle something up, the pressure builds, and then it blows and it manifests as anger and even violence. And so those are kind of the two items on the menu for men, neither one of which open the door into being able to acknowledge even to ourselves that we're shamed, much less to come to our loved ones and apologize for wrongdoings. Now remember, I'm talking with men who are early in recovery from addiction, and there's not a one of us, many of you who are watching today are intimately familiar with addiction, either through your own experience, such as myself, or through the addiction of a loved one. Very few of us get through life without having addiction in our families. In fact, a recent national survey suggested that 2/3 of Americans have active addiction in a family member. And a sad corollary to that was that 2/3 of those that responded said that they would never speak to anybody outside of their family about the addiction because there's so much societal stigma around addiction. So it's commonplace and we don't talk about it. And when I'm meeting with men who are in early recovery from addiction, I frame shame this way, is that the number one trigger for relapse is stress. And that study after study has indicated that the most stressful emotion for most of us to experience, the emotion that's correlated with the highest elevation in our stress hormones like cortisol and adrenaline, that emotion is itself shame. So it's important that we define shame next as we move more deeply into this topic of how are men to heal their relationships when they're too ashamed to even acknowledge or much less move towards their partners that they've wronged. We make a distinction, we did today, between guilt and shame. There's different language for this. I actually prefer using separate terms. There are some people that talk about shame in terms of healthy shame and toxic shame. I feel like that complicates things personally. I would prefer to use the term guilt to refer to the feeling I have when I have done something bad. And I actually prefer calling that rightful guilt. I should feel bad for having done something wrong. It's like putting your hand on a burner. If it's hot, you want to make sure that you have a response to that. And I feel the same thing around doing something wrong. The example I give in groups oftentimes, if I step on somebody's toe, I need to feel bad about that to correct that. And so guilt informs me of that and gives me incentive to not do that again. Where it crosses over into shame, or what sometimes is referred to as toxic shame, is where I take something that I've done that is bad and I convert that into not something I've done, but something I am, someone I am. In other words, I am something or someone bad. And as I asked the group today, I said, why does this distinction matter? How is this not just a semantic word game? The truth is it's pivotal, it seems like to me, in the healing that is necessary in this day and age, whether it's around addiction more specifically or more largely violations that men have perpetrated against the women and men in their lives. And so this distinction becomes very critical. Let me give you an example of that. If I feel guilty, I'm actually motivated to make amends. On the other hand, if I feel ashamed, shame freezes my response. It actually stops me in my tracks, and I won't be able to proceed towards making amends. So it's important to know that the one motivates me to move towards you, the other motivates me to move away from you. And to oftentimes, in fact, I asked today, what does shame feel like in our bodies? And people will talk about, it's not so much a verbal thing, not so much a word thing or a thought thing, it's an embodied emotion. And for some, it's like wanting to crawl into a hole. That's what shame wants us to do. So there's no way that in that impulse to crawl into a hole that we're going to be motivated or given courage to move towards somebody and extend apology. So that brings us to the core question of today. And we've touched on this before in a previous podcast, but never specifically geared towards men. And I'm going to specifically tie this in not only to men, but also those that are in recovery from addiction. So whether you're a man yourself or in recovery from addiction, or know a man, or know somebody who's in recovery from addiction, I think that you should find application here. And I'll talk us through this. This is the first time I've done this, what we're doing today. I want to weave together, on the one hand, some central processes that we've gained from psychology that go into making a full and robust apology. That's on the one hand. And I want to tie this information directly into the process of addiction, what happens to the brain in addiction, and a kind of a forum or a foundation for kind of grounding our conversation about apologies. So we'll be talking about it in the context of addiction. And so it'll give me a chance to bring to you some really basic information from the biology of addiction. My own belief is this, is that good left brain information about the biology of addiction can actually help a very seriously hampering right brain phenomenon such as shame. And so in that spirit, I do believe good information helps to free us. I think that shame paralyzes us, and I'm all for freedom here. Someone said in our audience, they thanked me for this great information. Thank you for sharing that, Austin. And I also want to welcome someone is dialing in from Seattle, Washington. And so I want to welcome you too. It's fun to hear from you all. Bring questions as we go along. It's going to get a bit, we'll see how this goes. I'm risking this being complex here, and just hang with me. I want to flesh this out, and we have time to flesh this out gradually together. So the question is this: what are the basic ingredients for making amends, for saying that I'm sorry? The first ingredient I want to focus on is to express caring. I want to give you an example, just to mention it here at the beginning. I came from a group just earlier today, and I told Franz and Austin when I got here that I was deeply moved by this group today. There was hardly a dry eye in the house. There were probably 15 men in this group, and one of them had the courage to share struggles that he's having right now around deep shame in reference to one of his parents. And he was really vulnerable in the group and brought this to us. And we worked with these ingredients of making amends using his example. He actually allowed for me to be him as we role-played this. And he was this parent with whom he has so many, there's so much shame evoked in relationship to this parent. And as I say, it was universal. You could have heard a pin drop today. And so I'm kind of coming in the spirit of having wept together, putting hands on this gentleman, honoring him, and holding him up as he faces moving through these stages. And so I really want to suggest it takes great courage to do what we're doing here. So if the first step is to express caring, let me just mention in this context what happens around this difference between guilt and shame. If I feel guilty, it's possible for my heart to stay open to you. If I feel ashamed, shame, as I said earlier, is a freeze response. It will shut down or close down my heart. And so one of the keys here is to be able to express caring, to be able to get it out, to be able to express it to you. As I shared today, and this is particularly to men, not exclusively, but particularly, is that oftentimes this first ingredient, this first step of expressing caring can be manifest as in terms of a nonverbal communication. I'm going to pause for a second. There's a note here. It's from Sydney, from someone in Sydney, Australia. I'll tell you what, I think that I'm going to have Austin respond right now to you online, and then I'm happy to follow up with you. I want to provide support for you. Appreciate you joining us. If you're able to listen in today and find value here, I hope that you can do that, and we'll follow up with you later in comments. Right now, Austin will respond. Thank you for reaching out. Appreciate it very much. What I was saying was that to express caring, oftentimes it's communicated most powerfully just through nonverbals. And I asked the men in the group today, I said, can you tell when somebody cares about you? And as opposed to, let's say, dead eyes, and everybody in the group could relate to that. And so it may be that it's communicated most profoundly just through a glance and through a tone in the voice. What I shared today in the group is that one way to express it to a parent would be just to say, I love you so much. To start with that as the premise of an apology is critical. And in fact, as I said today in the group, if I'm not in a place to be able to do that, it probably suggests I'm not quite yet ready to make amends, because if I make amends and just kind of go through the motions, that is, kind of go by rote, then it's not going to really take. It'll be a hollow or empty apology. And so I think it's critical to kind of start with the right attitude of the heart, and that is to express caring. The next ingredient is to legitimize the other person's experience. And by legitimize, I mean to indicate that their experience makes complete sense. Another word for this would be to validate their experience, that it's a valid experience. I want to discuss this second ingredient today in the context of, and introduce here the context of what happens to the brain in active addiction. And as we'll talk later, what continues to happen to the brain in early recovery. I'll wait till later to talk about that. But for right now, in active addiction, there are three changes, major brain changes, that affect behavior, and these behaviors directly impact relationships. And so in terms of this second ingredient, in regards to validating the other person's experience or legitimizing it, this isn't hard to do as long as we have some awareness of what's happened to our brains amidst addiction, how that's manifest in behaviors that have wounded others, that have injured others in a relationship. My shorthand for this is that our brains, particularly our ethical centers and the parts of us that relate empathically or compassionately towards others, those parts are shut off and our brains are hijacked. Particularly our frontal lobes are hijacked by addiction, and we can do the darndest things, the most damaging things, and oftentimes without awareness. And so when I talk about legitimizing, it's basically responding in good faith to say that you have every reason to be upset with me for what I've done. And my own experience has been, I can say that only if I am not ashamed. And that's not to say that I don't feel guilty. It's holding guilt for what I've done, and we'll flesh this out more in the next ingredients. It's holding guilt for what I've done, but not being stymied or paralyzed by shame. And for me, I have found, and for clients I've worked with, it can be very helpful to have a vocabulary for what happens to the brain in and around addiction. And so we're going to flesh that out over the next few ingredients. The third ingredient, we've just expressed caring, we've just legitimized, and now in this third ingredient, we own up to our responsibility. I'm talking about all of this in the context of addiction and recovery. I encourage you to apply this as well to any other situation, any other wrongdoing, is that for an apology to be anything other than empty, it needs to include this element, which is owning up to my responsibility. As I shared today, it means my willingness to fall on my own sword. I'm not pointing blame at anybody else. I'm taking responsibility for what I've done. Let me give you an example. Let's talk about one of the brain changes. This will be brain change number one, guaranteed with addiction. Every client that I see can relate to this, and I certainly can as well. One of the predictable changes in active addiction is that there is a numbed pleasure response. The brain structure most associated with this is the nucleus accumbens. If you have interest in finding out more specifics about this, I encourage you to reference previous podcasts that are available through this Facebook group. You can find the link to the archive through this Facebook group here at Ask an Addiction Specialist, where I've given at least 2 presentations that went in depth into what happens specifically in the brain. But for now, we're just going to stick with a numbed pleasure response. Now, how does that manifest behaviorally? How does my developing a numbness to pleasure manifest in interaction with you? Well, I'm going to give you 3 examples. This isn't exhaustive, but at least it suggests where we might take a look at the impact that we've had on others. The first thing, as I mentioned earlier, is just dead eyes. You can look at your beloved, whether it's a partner, a parent, a sibling, a child, and look at them with a hollow gaze. And so there's a flatness there. There's a flatness not only in the nonverbal communication, there's also a flatness in emotion, what I call here flatness of affect, which is just another word in psychology for emotion. And certainly there's a diminishment or a lack of passion. I had a gentleman ask me today at the beginning of our men's group, he said, "Dr. Bob, how long do I have to wait before normal pleasures begin to feel pleasurable again?" It was a good question, and I responded to him carefully. He had heard that it takes about a year after his particular addictions. And I said, that's a good rule of thumb, and I've heard the same thing. The fact is that it's very individual. Everybody's biology is different. Everybody metabolizes the process of addiction and early recovery differently. And so it's hard to come up with a ironclad rule for everybody. It also has a lot to do with the length, the duration of the addiction, and also the depth or the intensity of the addiction. So I wanted to let him know that it takes a while, but what I wanted to do was to encourage him to suggest that in most cases, given time, the brain is resilient, and what we'll find is the brain will recover the capacity for normal pleasures once again. In a nutshell, what happens is the brain begins to prune away those parts of itself to rebalance itself. It tends to prune away the receptors associated with pleasure, including the dopamine receptors, and it takes a while for those to rebuild. The brain, under the influx of substances, addictive substances, has to regulate itself, and so it downwardly regulates, and we lose the capacity then for normal pleasures. You remove substances, and it stands to reason that the teeter-totter will rebalance, but it takes a while. Imagine what it feels like to be the partner of you or me in active addiction, where what shows up in relationship is this numbness, is this lack of passion, is this flatness, is this deadness. And so for taking seriously this third step of owning responsibility for what we've done, it requires for us to acknowledge and own up to the fact that we've not really shown up in relationship, and to do so non-defensively. We're not blaming anybody else. We're not shuttling responsibility onto somebody else. It's taking complete ownership for ourselves. And if anything, what we're doing is we're laying the blame right at the door of addiction. This is what addiction does. Whether we look at addiction as an illness, as a sickness, however you want to look at it. I look at addiction from multiple perspectives, but one of them certainly is that addiction is a brain disease, and it certainly qualifies. And one of the impairments in the brain, specifically of the nucleus accumbens, is this flattening of our normal pleasure response. And unfortunately, sadly, tragically, that manifests powerfully in relationship, and is very painful to those that love us to be treated so unlovingly. There's a fourth ingredient in making amends, and that is that we express rightful guilt. You remember how I made the distinction between rightful guilt on the one hand, that I should feel guilty about things I've done, versus toxic shame on the other hand, that basically cuts me off at the knees and judges me out of hand. We have somebody, Masayo. Hello, Masayo. Just asking, she asked, is that neuroplasticity that I was just talking about? In fact, that was neuroplasticity I was just talking about, Messiah. When I spoke of resilience and the brain's ability to bounce back, The term plastic is used in neurology and neuropsychology. Plastic means to be flexible or fluid. So the idea of neuroplasticity is that our brains are marvelously adaptive, including quite resilient, even after years of intense duress under the influence of substance. And so thank goodness for neuroplasticity. In regards to ingredient number 4, expressing rightful guilt, let's give an example of something that we should feel rightfully guilty about and express our guilt about, and that would be brain change number 2. As I mentioned, all 3 of these brain changes are quite predictable, almost inevitable with sustained substance abuse and addiction. This second brain change is called increased craving. Increased craving, in fact, I've heard some people say this, is that the just say no movement, just say no to drugs. And for anybody who's been addicted, you realize how incredibly difficult that is to accomplish. And I've heard somebody mention this, as Dr. Kevin McCauley, recommend his videos on the memo to self, and I can't remember the name of the other one. It's one of my favorites. Somebody will write this in for me. He talks about it in both of those, is that I can say no temporarily. I can say no to my drug. I can not use my drug. The title of the first video that I was thinking of was Pleasure Unwoven, which is tied right into what we were talking about in terms of diminished pleasure response. Dr. McCauley says in that video, he says, an addict can temporarily say no. With gun to head, an addict can refuse not to drink and refuse not to use. But what an addict cannot do is eliminate craving. And I appreciate the compassion of Dr. McCauley here. I feel like he's absolutely accurate, is that with increased craving, what happens in the brain is that this process is seated in what's referred to as the ventral tegmental area, the VTA, which is associated with dopamine, which is connected to our craving. And so if the nucleus accumbens is tied into pleasure and liking a drug, a substance, the effects of it, the VTA, the ventral tegmental area, and the dopaminergic circuitry are tied into wanting or craving. And these are radically affected by sustained drug abuse, where what happens is that we get very sensitized to outer stimuli in terms of triggers, and also inner states of mind or being, such as anxiety. Ironically, shame itself is the biggest trigger for relapse. Why is that? Because an instant, we talked about this in today's group, an instant solution to my shame right now is to get high, is to take my substance of choice, to self-medicate. And so you can see that the risk of letting shame go unabated is heightened by the fact that it's hard to contain that, and the shame itself becomes a reminder or a stimulus for using. How does this increased craving, if that's going on in my mind as well as my numbed pleasure response, how does this manifest interpersonally? I've suggested a few examples here, and you can think of others, I'm sure, as well. One is that I'll be distractible. If I'm craving my substance, if I'm craving my drug of choice, I'm not going to really be paying full attention to you, that's for sure. It may manifest as a disengagement or a distancing from you. I don't really want to get caught up with you. I have this behavior that I'm wanting to enact. And another piece of it is that insofar as I'm frustrated, insofar as that craving is being frustrated, it's very likely that I'll be that much more irritable in your presence. And so this idea of being distractible, being disengaged, being irritable goes hand in hand with what happens in this second brain change. And in terms of expressing rightful guilt, who wants to be on the receiving end of what I just named? Who wants to be on the receiving end, for example, of irritability? And so we can express rightful guilt. It's not okay for me to have been so cranky, so irritable all of the time, and that you had to endure that. That's not okay. I feel really badly about this. This is expressing a remorse. I looked up a word this morning, and it's a word that we don't use much in English. It's contrite, C-O-N-T-R-I-T-E, contrite. And it ties into what we're talking about today, as well as the next ingredient. It ties into expressing remorse. And we're looking for contrition, to be contrite of heart. And that's an important communication. And in making amends, it won't do to plow through this without deep feeling and deep presence. And part of that presence is owning up to what I've done and expressing rightful guilt. That brings us to the next ingredient, which is ingredient number 5. And this is to express my upset at the pain I've caused you, to express upset at the other's pain. And this also ties into that word contriteness, contrition, contrite. Let's talk about a third behavior change and then tie it into this fifth ingredient here of expressing upset. A third brain change that's predictable across all addictions is decreased cognitive control or decreased self-control. Technically, this is referred to as hypofrontality. Sometimes when I've talked to individuals, even in our field of psychology, they don't understand that you don't have to be high to be hypofrontal. And I've referred them to the work, the pioneering work of Dr. Nora Volkow, V-O-L-K-O-W. Dr. Volkow is the head of the director of the National Institute on Drug Abuse in Washington, and she's done a tremendous amount of research around hypofrontality. The idea of this is that the frontal lobes go offline in addiction, and what's activated is the pleasure circuitry or the reward circuitry in the middle of the brain. And why is that important? Well, with the decrease in cognitive control or decrease in my frontal lobes, I lose the capacity to make executive decisions. I lose the capacity for empathy. I lose the capacity for long-term planning, making good judgments. I lose the capacity for operating ethically. All of these reside in the frontal lobes, and when those are diminished as radically as they are in active addiction, it's why we do the things that we do. And so knowing that we've experience this decreased control, it manifests in any number of ways in a relationship. I've listed 3 here. It manifests as impulsivity. Some people talk about the frontal lobes as the brakes, and if you remove the brakes in the brain, then all you're left with is the accelerator of the reward circuitry in the center of the brain, in the limbic system is what it's referred to as. And you have full-on acceleration, and so you have very little impulse control here, and that leads to all kinds of violations of relationships owing to just raw impulsivity. Other examples that are related to the loss of the frontal lobes is the frontal lobes also put the brakes on aggression. You remove that and then you just have full-on unmitigated aggression. And so a lot of the anger, rage, even violence that comes out, focusing here on men, but it would be both genders when this comes out as a function of addiction. It's what happens to the brain. My own belief about this is that anybody exposed to as much substance as I have used in the past, or maybe you have used in the past, anybody given enough substance will manifest all 3 of these behavior changes. It's very hard to understand if you're not in that state. It's even harder to understand if you've never been in that state of addiction, to know what it's like to lose cognitive control. So aggression, impulsivity, and finally, and I mentioned this already, poor judgment. And here I mean judgment just looks at the consequences of my action. That's the frontal lobes at work. You remove those, you don't have a navigator at the helm of the ship, and so judgment goes right down the tubes as well. Imagine how these manifest in a relationship. What it feels like to be partnered to somebody or parenting somebody who is chronically impulsive, aggressive, and uses hideously poor judgment. So there's lots of reasons here for expressing deep upset, profound upset at what we've caused others in terms of pain. There's a 6th ingredient, and this is the final ingredient of this of all that we've talked about, and that is to reassure the one that we've harmed, to reassure them about the future. We had a really rich conversation about this today. It's easy to make promises, and talk is cheap. It's almost better to reassure. A couple of them in the group today suggested, just would you please be patient and give me a chance to prove myself? Don't listen to what I say, see what I do. And so let our actions speak louder than words here in terms of reassurance. And as we talked about in the group, is that going through an apology with no intention of changing our behavior or what led to our behavior in the context of addiction is an insult. It's an insult to apologize like that. So for an apology to be full-bodied, it must include a commitment to behavioral change, that's for sure. I do want to mention something here that's important in the context of recovery, and it's PAWS, Post-Acute Withdrawal Syndrome. The men in the group today are all early in recovery, and every one of them is in a state of PAWS, somewhere on a continuum right now. And what that looks like is that oftentimes in this post-acute withdrawal, so acute withdrawal is just getting through the early withdrawal, the physical symptoms of recovery, moving into sobriety. But what remains are lots of behavioral and emotional irregularities. It's like a roller coaster, and this can go on for weeks or months for sure. And as I asked today in the group, many of the men in the group acknowledged that the significant people in their lives look at them as still using because they're acting as if they did when they were actively addicted. And this is tricky, to be partnered to somebody who's in PAWS. And so I ask me to factor this in, is that in early recovery, even as I reassure you that I'm about changing my behavior, it's important that we both be literate about the realities of PAWS. Now, how does PAWS impact relationship? Let's go back to the 3 behavior changes we talked about. How do numbed pleasure response, increased craving, and decreased impulse control, how do those impact relationship? And the fact of the matter is that those will remain in more or less intensity in the early months of recovery, more often than not, as a function of PAWS. So that brings us to the key here in terms of early recovery, and that is it's critical that not only the individual himself or herself who is recovering from drugs and alcohol addiction receive support for sobriety, it's just as critical that the loved ones of those that are in recovery, literally from addiction, that they also receive support, including support that dispenses the kind of information we're talking about today. The kind of brain changes we've discussed, the fact that even in early addiction, these will continue to have impact on their relationship, and to prepare for that. And so I think it's critical that there be support for those that are partnered parenting of those in early recovery, for sure. There is hope here. There is hope, and that's the good news. I think there's hope only if we conceptualize recovery in a broader sense than we typically do. Rightfully, there's a lot of emphasis placed on the individual who's in recovery, him or herself, to take responsibility for the recovery. That stands. That doesn't change. But we need to have a much more inclusive model. When I first moved down to Orange County, my wife and I started a group out of our own home, and we called it Recovery for Everyone. And that's what I've listed here today, is that the hope is that recovery would be inclusive of all family members as well, that they would be well educated, that they would feel well supported through the trials and tribulations, not just of active addiction in their partner or loved one, but also in early recovery as a function of post-acute withdrawal syndrome. So there is hope. That is the good news, but it's going to require recovery for everyone. I want to open up to check and see if there are any final questions as we begin to wrap up for today. Any final questions from our audience? It doesn't look like there are right now. If you have any questions, I want you to send those to me. I want to remind you that you can write comments, including questions, right on the Facebook page here as you're viewing us today. I also encourage you to sign out today by letting us know where you're watching, where you're watching from. And I'd also love to invite you to share, if you found value in what we discussed today, I'd love for you to share this. I have a passion for this information and getting it out there. I really do believe that good information is half the battle won. There is so much personal shame in and around recovery, and we're providing a means today. basically, I think of today as one half of what I'm working with men on a weekly basis, which is to discover ways and to practice ways of making heartfelt amends. I can guarantee you in the room today, as we were discussing this, that this wasn't theoretical. This was deeply personal. And several individuals, including the one I mentioned earlier, were weeping deeply with the sense of remorse, with the sense of guilt, with a wish to repair. And that I really appreciated what another man in the group mentioned today, and I'm just remembering it right now. He shared this as encouragement to the first individual, and he said that when he came into the treatment center, that he had loved ones communicating with him that they wrote him off. They were done with you. And he talked about later that day, after the first day, writing to them or speaking to them by phone and communicating a kind of humility and speaking out of his own native truth, speaking into amends with them. And it's really what they needed, is that it opened up the door, it opened a bridge between the two of them where it was closed in the morning. And so this making amends opens the door to non-shaming responses from those that love us. There's no magic formula, and as I shared today, there will be instances in which people will not forgive us. We can't bank on that, but we can do all we can to open the door to that. And in my view, it's laying down arms, opening ourselves non-defensively. As one individual said, it is letting go of our egos, letting go of our pride, and really drinking our bitter cup of remorse and regret and sharing that with those that we love, and then reassuring them that we're committed to change. I see a question just come up. It's Masayo again. Thank you, Masayo. Yeah. Masayo says that what we're talking about here in terms of active addiction and even early recovery, in terms of the symptoms we've discussed, we talked about the interpersonal symptoms, the relational symptoms that tie into a numbed pleasure response, what it's like to have a husband or wife look at you and really not see you, what it's like to be with somebody who's chronically irritable as a function of increased craving, what it's like to be with somebody who is aggressive and impulsive, acting out their addiction as a function of decreased cognitive control. It's horribly painful, and you're right, Masayo. There's a lot of suffering for the loved ones of those in addiction, and I'm sorry for your own pain for sure. It certainly ties into all that we've talked about. Sharon, thank you for your kind comment. She's chiming in here. She says, thank you for this informative session. I appreciate you saying that. And I appreciate you using the word informative. I really do believe that as one dear friend of mine, John Dupuy, the author of Integral Recovery, talks about it, good information is psychoactive, which is to say that good information changes our brains. And I don't think that good information alone is sufficient, but I think it'll get us a long ways towards something. So our talking about a couple things today, our talking about steps towards making amends, it's critical. I'll just summarize those real quickly for you. I have them memorized by heart. Let's see if I can do this on camera. It's that I express my caring to the individual, first of all. I have to pause for a second. I've lost the second one, so I have to go back and review it. Sorry, it's my nerves. The second one is to legitimize, so sorry about that. The second one is to legitimize or to validate. The third one is to own up to my responsibility. The fourth one is to express rightful guilt. The fifth one I'm also forgetting because of nerves, so I'll look at it too. This didn't go as well as I hoped. The fifth one is to express upset at the other's pain. And the sixth and final one is to reassure. And they all weave together. I'm not trying to say that these happen in some kind of sequence. I think what they are is they become kind of a checklist for, as I mentioned earlier, a full and robust apology needs to include at least these components. And so it's a way for me to evaluate my own apologies for their fullness. Yeah, Masayo wrote back just now after my previous response, saying that she's not sure if she's not enabling her partner by staying in relationship. And I think this is why I mentioned earlier this idea of recovery for everyone. The hope that there is here is that for the loved ones of those that are in recovery or in need of recovery from addiction, that they need support as well. I'm very, very supportive of groups like Al-Anon that are explicitly there to support those that are loved ones to keep themselves anchored in their own experience and to manage the storms of addiction and even early recovery. So any support that you can have. What I appreciate about support programs like Al-Anon is that they address in every meeting this issue of enabling. Another group is CODA, Codependence Anonymous. The focus is helping people to find their own center of gravity and not stay entangled in a relationship that facilitates or enables the ongoing addiction. It's really, really a test for sure. Thank you all for your questions, for your participation. We've provided information today about the 6 steps of making amends, 4 of which I've remembered by heart. Before I volunteer to do that again, I'm going to make sure that I have those in my... It's funny, I came from the group today and I was able to do them, but I'm a bit more nervous, I guess, here in front of you on camera. And also to weave in the 3 behavior changes that are related to brain changes that manifest as all kinds of relationally impactful behaviors that need to be owned up to and healed in relationship. I also want to finish this by saying I hope that what we talked about today is suggestive of what might need to happen in any case. And as I mentioned earlier, the conversation today with the men and the groups that I lead week after week with men is about making right what has been wrong. And one of my deepest wishes is to support a new generation of men who are able to step through the shroud of shame and be courageous and strong and vulnerable, strongly vulnerable in admitting the wrongs that they've done and then taking positive action to correct them. I work with men who are early in recovery from addiction, and the most important thing they can do is in my view, is to regain frontal function, and that requires sobriety. And so that's the most concrete thing that I can imagine. I believe that in most cases, what will follow from that is the regaining of empathy for their partners, as well as the regaining of their ethical center, all of which is under duress at best, eliminated at worst in active addiction. So I feel really committed to that. And so I feel like a conversation today, while in the context of recovery from addiction, can be opened up to address all of the wrongs that have been perpetrated against women and men as a function of men's unconsciousness. I do believe this, is that I do believe that recovery from addiction is critical in terms of sobriety. But I believe that's only half the way there. And then what needs to be addressed are the underlying issues, psychological, emotional, developmental, related to trauma, abandonment, neglect, all of these things that circulate within us men and us women that under the influence of addiction actually get acted out in ways that are subhuman to the extreme. And so the next step, it seems like to me, once things are stabilized in addiction, and I do want to say this, is a lot of this work has to happen after PAWS. You can do some really good foundational work in those early months of recovery, but there's an ongoing commitment that needs to extend, I believe, well beyond PAWS, to where the brain is back fully functioning or close to it, where the deep level emotional, psychological work needs to be done if there's really going to be sound and reliable healing. So I'm really arguing in favor of that. I mentioned earlier today that there's a corollary part to this this that we've talked about today, about making amends that are deep and effective, and that's connected to shame and specifically self-forgiveness. And what I want to look at next week is I want to bring to you my work specifically with men around this topic of self-forgiveness and how it is that's got to be developed as a daily practice if it's to be effective. And in some ways that self-forgiveness itself opens the doors to being able to make amends. They both tie into one another. There's very much a synergy between them. And so we'll be looking at this next week, and I encourage you to come back. I hope that you will do that. I want to thank you for joining me today. I really appreciate your support here. Please pass the word to your friends. Be sure to share this with any that could find value in it, those in addiction, those in recovery, and then the loved ones, which that pretty much includes all of us. Blessings to all of you. I also want to mention, if you want to find further resources along the lines of what we've talked about today, I commend you to our Facebook group here at Ask an Addiction Specialist. I also point you in the direction of my website. It's www.drbobweathers.com, and it's basically an informational clearinghouse, and it's meant to be of service. So thank you very much for your presence. Come back next week, and we'll be following up on today's presentation by looking next week at learning the skills of self-forgiveness, specifically as applied to men. Thank you so much. Bye-bye for now.